The February 10th, 2020 work session of the Williamsburg City Council will come to order. Ms. Felico, would you call the roll, please?
Mr. Maslin?
Here.
Ms. Ramsey?
Here.
Mayor Freiling?
Here.
Vice Mayor Pons?
Here.
Mr. Zhang?
Here.
Ms. Liebel? Mr. Stevens? Mr. Gross?
Here.
Mr. Kohler? Mr. Edwards?
Here.
Mr. Spence? Here. Mr. Kohler? Castro?
Here.
For those of you in the audience today and anybody who might be watching on television, this City Council work session is going to be different from most of the ones that we undertake. This is a joint meeting of City Council and our Architectural Review Board. But before we get to that discussion, I come to Mr. Trivett. Any items for City Council that you'd like to preview for our upcoming meeting?
So we do have one public hearing that will consider adding the senior housing as a use in the economic development district here in the city. And then under new business, we have a construction easement request from VDOT on the Waller Mill property as it relates to I-64's Segment 3 expansion. And then a few housekeeping issues related to budget amendments.
Any questions for Mr. Trivett? At this time, I'd welcome any member of the public to come forward if you have questions about or comments about any of the items on our Thursday agenda or any item of interest to you. We would love to hear that. Seeing no one come forward, we'll move on to background presentations and discussions, the first of which is the importance of historic preservation. And with us today, we have Dr. Jeffrey Klee. Welcome, Dr. Klee.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor and City Council. I appreciate the chance to talk to you today about a subject that I think we all sort of understand pretty well, but from time to time it's useful to have a little refresher to sort of remind us of why preservation is so important to this community. And I'm going to start by doing something I may come to regret, which is telling a little story that was related to me by one of my predecessors. He is known not just around the country, but around the world, is because of historic preservation. There are plenty of other quiet colonial capitals in the eastern United States, places like Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Newcastle, Delaware, that would love to be as visited, to be as renowned as we are, but they're fine little communities, but they don't have what we have, which is this impeccably restored historic core. So we're on the map, as I say, because of historic preservation. And that work requires ongoing commitment. Now, what I would like to do today is sort of review some of the history of how we got here, some of the history of preservation in the United States, and some of the motivations for historic preservation in the United States. And there really are three that we pay attention to. The first one is maybe obvious here, which is patriotism. People have looked at historic structures as embodiments of patriotic values, as embodiments of virtue on the part of the founding generation, and Mount Vernon, of course, is the quintessential example of that. Two more, which I'll talk about in a second, are the preservation of vanishing folkways. This is not one that's been quite as important here in the United States, but in Europe, there are a number of open-air museums similar to Williamsburg that were established in the 1890s and the early 20th century as a response to industrialization. Their founders looked at industrialization as having a cost, and one of those costs was the elimination of traditional domestic handcrafts, for example. One of those costs was the removal of national distinctions, distinctions in culture, distinctions in music, distinctions in the visual arts, and saw museums like this one, open-air museums, as a way to preserve some of those activities, to preserve some of that culture. The third, of course, is aesthetics. We have looked to historic preservation as a way to hang on to what are believed to be our most extraordinary, most beautiful buildings. So we'll look at a couple of examples of that too. So this work really gets underway in the 1850s. There's a few sort of signal moments that historians point to, beginning with Mount Vernon, which in the 1850s, as you can see from this photograph, was not in very good shape. There was a sense that it might actually fall to the ground, that it might not survive. And so Anne Pamela Cunningham, as many of you know, decided that she would sort of rally her peers initially and the nation at large in time to save Mount Vernon, and indeed she did. It's one of the great success stories of the historic preservation movement that begins, as I say, in the 1850s. A second, closer to home, is this one, the Raleigh Tavern, which was recognized in the 1850s as a key site for the development of the Revolution. It was the place, as you all know, where the Burgesses met after being dissolved by the governor, and so it's seen as one of the sacred sites, really, of the Revolution. Benson Lossing, the journalist who visited this town in 1848, believed as much and saw fit to reproduce this illustration in his book called The Pictorial History of the American Revolution in 1851 of the interior of the Apollo Room. I would call your attention, it's a little difficult to see maybe on the small monitors, it's easier here, I would call your attention to the little illustration on the floor, which is a carpenter's toolbox with a saw and an axe laying across it. What Lossing wanted to convey was the imminent threat posed to the Raleigh Tavern. In fact, by the time this book was published, not only the front of the tavern, but also the rear had been demolished. In fact, it had been lost. So despite Lossing's best efforts, we did in fact lose the Raleigh Tavern by 1851. In 1856, the editor of the Gazette, Hervey Ewing, wrote that the streets of Williamsburg are sacred. Her buildings are living monuments of patriotism. Now, Ewing was not a card-carrying preservationist, had no discernible interest in architecture particularly. He was a journalist, but he recognized the value of what remained of the physical fabric of this community from the Revolutionary era. So these were all hugely important, and in their way, I think, laid the groundwork for the work that W.A.R. Goodwin did here in the 1920s and the 1930s. That there was work beyond Virginia that also was happening in these same decades. This is not a success story. The John Hancock house, the house where John Hancock lived in Boston on Beacon Hill in 1863, was threatened with demolition. It was going to be replaced by a handful of row houses by a developer, and there was a huge outcry in the city of Boston. That outcry was not enough to stop its demolition, and that same year, the building was pulled to the ground. Greater success stories came later. This is the house of Paul Revere, which too was threatened with demolition. It was surrounded by tenement houses at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, but through the efforts of a local group, was in fact restored in 1908. This idea of preserving folkways, folk traditions, as I say, is more associated with European preservation movements, their European preservation effort. This is a quintessential example established in 1891. This is a museum called Skansen, which is really in the center of Stockholm, or just at the edge of Stockholm, where it's a fantastic public park. This is another example. This is in the Netherlands, the Netherlands Openlucht Museum, which is again an open-air museum. That's still visited. Both of these are still visited today. They get huge visitation from school groups and all kinds of individuals. Finally, the third motivation, which has been the aesthetic one, we have had some success over the course of the 20th century in identifying really excellent examples of the history of American design, beginning in the colonial period and extending virtually up to the present, and selecting them for especially careful stewardship. A fine example here, the first Harrison Gray Otis house, which is a kind of classic example of federal design, post-revolutionary design in America. Today it's the headquarters of Preservation New England. Closer to home, Carter's Grove, a building which we all know so well, really was chosen not for its association with any particular individual, but because it's a beautiful, an extraordinary building with a fabulous interior. And much closer to home, of course, the George Wythe House, which today is a sort of icon of Williamsburg, but it's an icon both for its association with George Wythe and thereby Thomas Jefferson, but also for the kind of what I would describe as the subtlety, the subtle elegance of its design. This too is just an exceptional piece of Georgian-era design in Virginia. Now, these motivations, particularly the aesthetic and the patriotic, really come together here in the 1920s in the person of W.A.R. Goodwin, but also I think in the larger restoration effort that gets underway in earnest in 1928. And so some of the first buildings that were restored were ones that were especially beautiful, especially wonderful. The palace, of course, and the fantastic palace interior. One of the reasons for, let me put this a little different way. There was, in the minds of Goodwin and others in the sort of founding years of colonial Williamsburg, an association between the quality of the ideas that were being developed here and the quality of the buildings in which some of those events happened. So these two, as I say, these two sort of motivations for preservation, the aesthetic and the patriotic, really merged here in a way that I think is quite distinctive. That sort of approach wasn't restricted to, or that attitude wasn't restricted to our largest and best buildings like the Palace. It also informed the decisions to restore buildings like the Thomas Everard House. This comes much later in 1949, but nonetheless it was perceived as a place where people could understand that these ideals weren't just restricted and that the events of the Revolution and the importance of Williamsburg wasn't just restricted to its largest and most famous and most beautiful buildings, but also could be addressed, could be understood, people could be inspired in relatively small, relatively modest buildings like this one. And that, I think, is one of the things that really distinguishes this community from some of its peers around the country, which is to say, we take a much more comprehensive, a much more holistic, if you like, approach to the preservation of this environment. It's not enough for us to simply preserve the Wythe House, to simply reconstruct the palace. We want to see the ensemble. We want to see the entire yard at the back of the Thomas Everard House. That is a way that, it's something that permits visitors to immerse themselves in this environment in a way that they can't do other places, or that they can do very, very few other places. That means that we devote the same level of effort to something like the George Wythe House, or if you like, the College of William and Mary, the Wren Building. We devote the same level of effort and care to the very, very humblest buildings in the historic area, which include our little outbuildings. So here, 3 original outbuildings behind the Grizzle Hay House. As I say, this distinguishes us, but I think it's also worth reflecting on the ways in which other places haven't been as successful in preserving the environment surrounding the key historic sites. And so this is the Paul Revere House. This is another view of the same building that I showed you just a moment ago, showing you a little bit more of its environment today. It's really surrounded by these towering apartment houses that make it seem as though it doesn't belong here, which of course it does. Historically, when we go back through and look at historic photographs of even some of these great success stories, like the Harrison Gray Otis House, we frequently find that the modern world encroaches upon historic sites in ways that were thought to be then, and I think we would think now, are disagreeable. And so here's some commercial development that was right up to the front yard, right around the front yard of the Harrison Gray Otis House in the early 20th century. What this ends up doing is reflecting a community's values at a moment. And in this photograph, I don't think we see a community that values that big building up on the hill there. So this can be taken to extremes, of course. This is simply a contrast between a more pristine approach to the preservation of a historic environment on the right, and on the left, one where the preservation of the historic environment doesn't seem to have entered into the calculation at all. There's no need to dwell on that. Now, in terms of the development of the preservation movement in the United States, all of these undertakings were done privately. All of these undertakings are either done by individuals, or individuals who inspire a movement, or communities working together, museums. In 1966, really from 1963 to 1966, that changed. And it changed largely because of this building. There are other things too, but this really galvanized a national movement that said we can't simply rely on people's goodwill to continue to preserve our important buildings. This is the former Penn Station in New York City, built 1908 to 1910 by McKim, Mead, and White. Really an extraordinary monument of early 20th century design, a source of enormous pride and a source of enormous pleasure, I think it's fair to say, to people not just living in New York, but people coming and going to and from New York. based, if you're really looking for the full art historical story, based in part on the baths of Caracalla, a Roman bath from the 2nd century AD. The interior was extraordinary as well, every bit as marvelous as the exterior. This is the main concourse here. This is the part of it that is most explicitly derived from the Roman baths. In 1963, it was determined that this would be demolished and replaced by a sort of ordinary, in this case modern, uninspired office structure and a new train station. And New Yorkers who treasured the old building were furious. They were enraged. But they could do nothing. And so by 1966, the building was gone. In the memorable words of Vincent Scully, lamenting this demolition and speaking of the old Penn Station versus the new, he said, "Before, one entered New York like a god. Now, one scuttles in like a rat." Just to kind of capture this extraordinary divergence between the old fabulous building, just 50 years old at the time, and the new one that replaced it. Now, to come back to Williamsburg, how is all this relevant to what we're up to today and as some of us kick off the guideline review? I think it's fair to say that there's a consensus in this community that buildings like the Wren Building, buildings like the entire historic area are indeed sacred, and that they should not be touched, that they should be well maintained as they have been since the restoration began in 1928. There's no doubt in my mind, or I think anyone in this room, the mind of anyone in this room, that these are at risk. I think the same is true of Merchant Square, genuinely one of the great commercial districts in North America. Just an exceptional place to spend time, an exceptional place to eat at a restaurant or to go to a store. Here too, I think nobody in this room has any question about whether this is at risk. I do think there is a sense in this community, and a developing sense, that there are some buildings, though, out at the periphery that may be at risk, that some of our edges some of our edges include buildings that we may not value as much as I would like us to. And those include buildings like this. This is what we call a four-square, just an ordinary family house from the 19-teens. There are a handful of these from the World War I era still in town. Here, a lovely bungalow over on Capitol Landing Road. These are relics of, these are houses that were for ordinary members of this community in the early 20th century. And are easy to overlook. It's easy for us to overlook their significance when we compare them to things like the Wren Building, when we compare them to things like Merchant Square. I think it's fair to say that they don't rise to that level of significance. And yet, I would just ask us to do a little bit of math for a moment and consider the fact that when Mount Vernon was at risk in 1853, the revolution was only about 60 years old. The revolution had only happened about 60 years before. These are about 100 years old, maybe 110 years old. We've done a good job up to this point of maintaining what is left of that inventory of relatively modest, generally affordable housing across town. As I say, I do think that there is a sense that these buildings are at risk because it is harder to see their value when they are in the same neighborhood, when they're in the same community as things like the Wren Building and the Palace and the Capitol. I'd like to close with maybe a cautionary tale. This is the house of John P. Coburn, who was an African-American entrepreneur in Boston in the antebellum decades. As the Civil War drew closer, he became involved with the Underground Railroad. He had 2 or 3 houses in a neighborhood of Boston, of which this is the first over the course of his adulthood. This house was halfway to being demolished in about 2007 when the city became aware of it. The city of Boston has its own careful preservation program. Because of the siting of this house, no one in the city realized that it was actually being demolished until it was about halfway done. What was proposed, what was intended by a developer, was essentially a replacement of the building as it was. He wanted to rebuild what was there just using modern materials to make it, as he saw it, fitter for sale. This house looks a little rough around the edges. It clearly needs a little bit of work, but it was far from unsalvageable. Even in this condition, floor joists were still solid. the material that was still left in this building were sound enough to draw floor plans and make a full record of it. In the end, what happened was it was indeed replaced by what its builder thought was a pretty good copy, and this is the result. And lest you think that this was an exercise in creating some affordable housing in Boston, this is about a 1,700 square foot house, relatively small. It was most recently assessed for $1.4 million. So there was very little gain to the city of Boston as a consequence of this, except a marginal increase in some tax revenue. And a great deal was lost. So to come back to Williamsburg. Again, I think we need to, it's easy for us to lose sight of the importance of the restoration effort, and I think the importance of even the decades before the restoration of Williamsburg in the 1920s and 1930s, when we are surrounded by sites like the Wren Building, by sites like the Wythe House, by sites even like the Thomas Everard House. It's easy for us to lose sight of its significance, but it's essential that we do not. As we approach the 100th anniversary, we are further from that event than our predecessors were in the 1930s from the Civil War. And as a consequence, they saw buildings that predated the Civil War, many of them, as less consequential. And yet we regret today their loss. So I urge continued careful stewardship. I think we've done an excellent job up to this point. With a few regrettable losses, I think we've done an excellent job up to this point of even hanging on to our early 20th century fabric, and I would ask us to continue to do that. I have a few things I'd just like to say before Carolyn gets up and makes her presentation concerning some of the things that I know are, I don't want to say on the table, but going to be discussed as we begin doing the guidelines. The first is the use of synthetic materials and whether the prohibition against synthetic materials in some sections of the guidelines is hypocritical. And the way that I've heard it expressed is, well, if Colonial Williamsburg can use concrete shingles on its buildings in the historic area, how can we prohibit people from using vinyl siding on their houses? The use of concrete shingles in the historic area goes all the way back to the 1920s, of course, when city regulations required new buildings to have a fireproof roof. So those buildings couldn't have wooden roofs at that time. It's something that the foundation has continued to do as a means of fireproofing, in part because many of the buildings in the historic area have antiques in them, and where people can get out, the antiques cannot get themselves out in the event of a fire. So synthetic materials, I think, and additionally, roofing has generally been something, historically, certainly since the late 18th century, where builders in Virginia and elsewhere have looked to materials other than wood, including metal, for example. So there's a metal roof in parts of Monticello. There's a great metal roof, or there was before the building burned, on Rosewell, the great early 18th century mansion house over in Gloucester County. The second thing is preservation is expensive. And high quality preservation of the kind that Colonial Williamsburg practices can indeed be expensive. Preservation is very labor intensive. I think it's worth observing that the money spent on preservation and on labor stays in this community in a way that importing objects like whether it's siding or windows or whatever else does not. I think the other thing to say is that maintenance is not that expensive, and preservation is essentially maintenance. We've been doing a good job of maintaining the built environment here, and we do that through ongoing maintenance, through careful stewardship. The last thing that I think is worth just addressing briefly is there's a sense that a city with a strong preservation ethic would not have permitted projects like Midtown Row, projects even like High Street, and projects like the work that's happening out at Quarter Path. I think this is simply incorrect, quite frankly, because what I think we've done in this community quite successfully, and we continue to do it successfully, is balance a real need for economic development with a real need for careful stewardship of the historic environment at the core of the city. We have been less permissive close to the historic area and that critical area right around Duke of Gloucester Street, and we've been quite a bit more permissive, I think quite rightly, out at the edges of town. As we get further away from Duke of Gloucester Street, we permit a much wider range of buildings. This is written in the Architectural Review Guidelines, and in its own way, or in a slightly different way, it's in fact written into the comprehensive plan. So, in closing, I want us to be proud of the work that we've done over the last 90 plus years, but I do want to insist that we can't rest on our laurels. I think we've done an excellent job, but we cannot consider the work of the preservation of this community to be done. It continues, and I hope it continues for decades more. So with that, I either turn it over to Carolyn, or I'm happy to take questions if now is an appropriate time
Dr.
to do
Klee,
that.
if you'd be kind enough to indulge us, in case
Absolutely.
my colleagues have any questions.
No, I'll reserve for later, after Carolyn gives her presentation, maybe then.
We'll reserve for later.
Same for me.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Great, thank you.
The baton has been passed, Ms. Murphy.
The baton has definitely been passed.
I get the feeling it might be handed off again very soon.
I'm handing it off soon. I want to thank Dr. Klee for taking the time out to come and speak to us today on preservation. As we kick off the design review guidelines, I'm going to have Erin Burke, who you know is our principal planner and who is in charge of the Architectural Review Board on the planning side of the staff, go over a few slides with you, and then we'll take any questions you may have.
Have a backup. Sorry about that. So I'll apologize in advance. These slides are pretty content heavy. I'm not going to read them word for word because nobody likes having a PowerPoint read to them. But I'm going to hit the highlights on all of them. And if you have any questions while I'm in the middle of this, please stop me. We're getting ready to kick off the update for the design review guidelines. And just a little bit of background information on those. They were recommended in the 1989 comprehensive plan, and they were first incorporated in 1991. They've been updated 6 times since then through a series of update processes. They've also seen intermittent amendments as things have come forward. Most recently, we've addressed solar panels and small cell wireless facilities. So they have changed moderately between those major updates. There was an architectural survey of the city that was done in 1992, and in the 2013 guidelines, which are the ones we use currently, it was updated. And then again, in the 2020 comprehensive plan, which we're hopefully getting towards the end of, one of the recommendations in that section of the plan for community character is to update the guidelines again. So the guiding principle for the design review guidelines, I will read this one to you, is to enhance the quality of life for all residents and visitors to the city by preserving the character and desirable aesthetic features of the community. This is kind of the guiding principle for the design review guidelines in the city. This is a map of the districts that the ARB and the design review guidelines supervise. I'm sorry it's not showing up on that screen over there. I don't know why. But the core of the city in yellow you can see here is AP1, and that's primarily the Colonial Williamsburg area and a little bit of the periphery around that. AP2 is shown in orange, and you'll see some older neighborhoods generally closer to the core of town. AP3 is shown in purple. It's a little difficult to see. There's 2 smaller sections, and that includes the Arts District. And then the Corridor Protection District is the area that you see in green, and that kind of outlines all of the entranceways into the city. So when we have visitors and guests coming into the city, they see these areas first. I'm going to go district by district, and I'll hit the highlights in each of those districts. Again, AP1 is in the core of the city. It includes the CW area. It also includes the old campus of William and Mary. And we have two National Historic Districts, Pollard Park and Chandler Court. And those are both in this area. In AP1, the use of the materials that you'll primarily see are going to be brick and horizontal siding. This is for new construction. The horizontal siding has to be wood. In this district, they do not allow for synthetic trim or synthetic materials. Entrance doors, as you'll see kind of throughout the guidelines, are wood. Later on, the introduction of fiberglass is allowed, but not in AP1. For windows in new construction, we allow for wood, vinyl-clad wood, aluminum-clad wood. We do not allow for synthetic windows in AP1. And as Dr. Klee noted, the use of different roofing materials is permitted in AP1. For existing buildings, the wood trim and the wood siding that's on them must be replaced in kind. This means that if somebody's doing repairs to a structure in AP1, that they'll be replacing those materials if they need to be replaced with similar materials, both in the exposure of the siding and the type of the siding. Again, synthetic trim and siding are not allowed for replacement in AP1. And if there's existing wood windows, that those should be retained and remain on the structure in AP1. Roofing materials may be replaced in kind, and then the use of new roofing materials is also allowed, again, to address concerns for fire spread. AP2 contains the additional neighborhoods that surround the AP1 area, College Terrace, Burns Lane, Capitol Heights, Indian Springs, and West Williamsburg. These areas are a little bit, we'll use the word newer, but we'll use that loosely. They contain structures that were remaining or have been moved following the restoration period. In new construction, we introduced a new material in addition to brick and wood siding. In AP2, we allow for cementitious siding, so hardy plank, something like that. Wood shingles may be allowed if they're appropriate. This is where you'll see the introduction of fiberglass for permitted use in doors. Wood is obviously also allowed. Wood windows, vinyl clad, aluminum clad are all allowed for new construction. And you'll also see the introduction of synthetic windows. ARB has reviewed a couple of cases recently for new construction that we've had a really good, high-quality composite window that's been used very successfully. And again, the same roof materials that are allowed. In AP2, for existing construction, we strongly encourage the use of retaining the wood siding and trim on buildings that are eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. Those have to be retained. If they need to be replaced, they have to be replaced to match. Wood siding and wood trim on buildings that are 50 years or older, which really wasn't that long ago if you think about it, should be replaced with the wood siding and trim that matches the existing wood siding. Excuse me. We also have allowances for materials that are no longer available. In some cases, you'll see the use of asbestos siding or aluminum siding. A lot of those items are no longer available. They cannot be replaced. So the guidelines have an allowance to let a homeowner remove those materials that are no longer available and introduce new materials there. Wood windows, again, should be retained and repaired for buildings located in AP2. And then the roof materials should be retained and repaired in kind. If not, then we have the typical allowable roof materials. For AP3, these are kind of smaller areas, kind of scattered on either side of the city. We'll see mostly post-World War II homes. You'll see those in Crispus Attucks, Capitol Court, Pinecrest, and West Williamsburg Heights. And this also includes the Arts District area. The Arts District is kind of a subset in AP3, and there's a little bit more freedom and flexibility for color and design in that area. AP3 is generally our most liberal residential district. So you'll see the use of vinyl and aluminum siding in addition to the brick, wood, and cementitious siding that we allow elsewhere. And you'll also see the use of the more prevalent use of high-quality synthetic windows. The Architectural Review Board has allowed them in a number of cases, and the quality of the window is really to protect the homeowner. There's a big difference in quality when you get into synthetic windows. And so we typically ask the homeowner to present us with a sample. And primarily we want to see that the window itself is a solid window and that it's not a hollow window. And that's to preserve the quality of the window in the long term. And again, you'll see the typical roof materials that are allowed. For existing buildings, we have the same regulations for wood trim and wood siding as you've seen in previous districts. And then there are allowances, again, for materials that are no longer available. Synthetic trim is allowed on a case-by-case basis. We've seen that in a number of cases. Folks will bring in a sample, and most of the time the ARB is able to approve it because of the quality of the sample. The last section that we'll discuss is the Corridor Protection District. And the guidelines break this out into two separate sections. One is for commercial use and one is for residential use. In the Corridor Protection District commercial, which you'll think of when you think of Richmond Road or Capitol Landing Road, you'll see the use of brick, also the use of horizontal wood or cementitious siding. The ARB has the ability to allow for other higher quality products in that area, and we'll see those a lot in the Midtown Row development as it comes online. This section of the guidelines is also the only section besides signs that specifically addresses lighting, and it talks about the compatibility of lighting to the site and the safety features that lighting provides. Later in the presentation, I'll talk a little bit more about lighting. It also specifically addresses the use of canopies. This is the area that we'll see our gas stations in. And it talks about the overall design, addressing the architecture of the main building and ensuring that the canopy of the gas station does not exceed the height of the main building, that we don't want that to be the primary feature on the property. For new construction, you'll see a lot of the same things in the residential side of the Corridor Protection District. It also allows for synthetic trim that resembles wood, such as cellular PVC, is allowed in this district. And it's not on a case-by-case basis, but it's actually just a permitted material. You'll also see the same type of wood windows, vinyl-clad wood, pre-finished aluminum-clad wood, and cellular PVC windows are allowed in this district. And the same, again, roof materials that you've seen previously. For existing buildings, we have the same, there's not a whole lot of existing residential in the Corridor Protection District. There are some, and those guidelines very closely match those for AP2 and AP3. Then I put together kind of a list of universal guidelines. These are the guidelines that you'll see in every section of the design review guidelines, regardless of the district that you're looking at. Mechanical equipment and trash facilities, it's recommended that those be located on the side of the structure and screened. Retaining walls have the same materials throughout the guidelines. The use of wood, aluminum, or wrought iron fences are throughout the guidelines. Chain link, wire, plastic, and vinyl fences are specifically excluded. One of the things that our homeowners very much appreciate is that if they're repainting their house and they're using approved colors from the guidelines, they don't have to go before the Architectural Review Board, as long as they're using 3 or fewer colors. And those are typically, I'll get a phone call from a homeowner asking about that. I can walk them through the process. If they tell me what they're using and that it's an approved color, then they're allowed to go ahead and repaint without having to come before the board, so they don't have to wait for something like that. And then lastly, site furnishings are required to be reviewed, and they're reviewed on a case-by-case basis. And site furnishings include everything from benches and trash cans to fire pits to light fixtures, that kind of thing. Two more sections in the guidelines. One addresses signs, and specifically the color of the signs and the type of illumination, whether it's an interiorly illuminated sign or exterior illumination. And that discussion has happened quite frequently recently as far as color goes, primarily because we are required to approve colors that are part of a trademarked sign. So if we have a larger company that's in town and they're redoing their sign face and they have a trademarked logo, those colors have to be approved by ARB. Lastly, awnings we review those for material, color, and whether or not they're illuminated. And you see a lot more of those along Richmond Road than I think most anywhere else in town. So these are just a couple of little changes or little potential changes that staff has identified throughout the years. If you have the pleasure of flipping open my guideline book, it has notes and scribbles all over the inside of it of things that I think that should be addressed or potentially discussed or changes that need to be made. Firstly is the incorporation of new materials. The last time we updated the guidelines was 5 years ago. We have a lot more new materials to discuss and review. We've had a couple of salesmen come into our architectural review boards just to present their new windows or new materials that they're potentially looking at using within the city. And so I think we have the opportunity as we update the guidelines to just officially incorporate those materials so that they don't have to be reviewed on a case-by-case basis. One of the other things I just mentioned was the discussion of trademarked sign colors. I think that it would be the ideal time to incorporate that language into the guidelines. Currently, if there's something that's a trademark logo color, it cannot go on our consent agenda because the way the guidelines are written. The consent agenda allows an applicant essentially to come to the meeting and leave within 5 minutes. If they have to be heard, then they just have to wait for their turn. So I think that would make it a little bit easier for everybody. One of the things that we had in the past 2 years was a discussion about wood siding on existing structures. So the way the guidelines are currently written is if you want to repair or replace your wood siding, you can do that. And if it's the same for same, it allows you to remove wood siding and replace it without having to go to the Architectural Review Board. The concern there is the quality of the siding that you're getting as far as wood goes. You can probably still find some really good cypress or cedar siding, but it's not going to be old growth lumber. And the quality and the long-term viability of that siding is not going to be as high. So I think that it would be a good idea to have a discussion on retaining wood siding as much as possible. Another thing we've had a lot of discussion about in the Corridor Protection District in cases is the use of other colors. We'll see more, corporate colors and the use of those in some areas, and possibly discussing the incorporation of additional colors. Currently, we use the Benjamin Moore colors for Colonial Williamsburg throughout the guidelines, and so it might be a discussion point talking about the Corridor Protection District. And lastly, I mentioned the only place in the guidelines that we talk about lighting is in the Corridor Protection commercial area. And we've seen a lot more individuals wanting to use lighting both in AP1 and AP2 and AP3, but also in residential applications. And while one person might like their house lit up, their next door neighbor might not like their yard lit up, so it leads to a larger conversation there. I think this is the ideal opportunity to take some time to talk specifically about lighting. We don't address it in the zoning ordinance either, and so because it's an aesthetic discussion, it might be the ideal place to put it in the guidelines. Last part of this is our schedule. We have a public hearing scheduled next Tuesday in this room at 6 p.m. And that's essentially for the Architectural Review Board to hear the public and the public have the opportunity to go on record about changes that they would like to see in those guidelines. After that, the Architectural Review Board has agreed to meet, and this is a complicated way to describe it, the Monday before their first meeting each month. So they'll hold an additional meeting, and in addition to the regular 2 meetings they'll have a meeting specifically to go over guidelines. And I've tried to condense it down to a chapter a month. The Corridor Protection District is a large chapter, so it might be a little bit of a longer meeting. Signs and awnings are technically 2 separate chapters. I think that's something that we can address in one meeting. And the rehabilitation, relocation, and demolition chapters generally don't change too much, so I've put those all together for a single meeting. The ARB will hopefully hold a public hearing for adoption in September. It will go to Planning Commission in October and hopefully be back before City Council in November. That, I'm available if you have any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Burke. Come to my colleagues for any questions or discussion.
Thank you very much, Ms. Burke, and certainly thank you, Dr. Klee. You know, reminded, particularly with your presentation, Dr. Klee, of how wonderful of an area that we have and how unique and deserved of preservation, which requires all of our stewardships, and but not just physical assets, but just some of the people like yourself who are able to communicate that and you know, study that and share that knowledge with us. And so I thank you for your efforts there, and thank you. So, and same with a lot of members on ARB and certainly staff. You guys got a lot of knowledge and a lot of good desire to preserve Williamsburg. So I guess a couple questions. When we talk about the AP 1, 2, 3, it seems like as we move away from the historic area, which I think we all agree we shouldn't change and we shouldn't talk about using different materials there, unless Glen Williamsburg and their stewards come and make a, you know, real pitch. I mean, I would imagine they're the knowledgeable ones, and so maybe I could consider that then. But for the most part, we don't want to touch it because, you know, it needs to be preserved and maintained. But as we move out, you know, I think we've identified that the further we get away from the historic area, now the ages of homes is somewhat different, we're more tolerant of using different materials. Is that fair to say?
That's certainly how the guidelines are written
Yeah.
currently, yes.
And so, that's kind of where my mind is going, which then kind of ties into this list of houses that are 50 years old. We started that in 1992, right? But we didn't hold that date and time. It's every year as we go forward, it's 50 years older. So, for example, my house in 1992 was 51 years old. Today, it's almost 80 years or whatever it is. But we're not saying houses that were 50 years older in 1992 are the ones being preserved, right? Right. So a house built in 1968 is now 52 years old, and so it has a different standard to it?
It can, yes, and that's not necessarily an arbitrary number. That number is picked and is actually used by the Secretary of Interior. Their standards dictate 50 years old, and it's funny because, you know, if you think of something that was built in 1965, you don't really think of it as being historic, but the style of architecture or the type of materials that they were using then are different than what we use now.
Sure. And so then going back to materials, I think part of what I appreciate about this opportunity is and I think you staff identifying those potential changes kind of leads into that. So I'm hopeful that conversation will happen, because I think we all recognize that there are better products today that may be more energy efficient or may last longer, may need less maintenance requirements, more affordable. And I know that there's some, you know, I say that, but I think we ought to consider that. But then at the same time, we need to be cognizant of, for example, my house. You know, it's not really that significant of a house. It's 81 years old now, and so I personally want to preserve it. I'm sure that in 200 years, when somebody wants to tear it down, they're not going to say, well, you know, that's the Pond's house. Well, let's not do that. They're going to want to tear it down.
But maybe they want to.
Under the guidelines and change that now.
So, you know, the people that, well, Mary Daniels was certainly prominent at the college back in the day. But I think there's some houses, maybe on my block, on College Terrace, that aren't as significant, and maybe we could look at using a different type of window. And so I think window products, I think we need to look at particularly. Same with siding. I did an addition, and I've got hardy plank, and I don't know that it's any more maintenance free. You still got to paint it, and squirrels still eat it, and it's still a problem. But I understand the value of it, and certainly it was more affordable than wood at the time. So I'd like that we're going to, at the ARB, to be looking at materials. I think we need to look at that as it relates to the districts. And I think we ought to look at that as it relates to particular houses. And I don't know if that's an arduous process to go in and identify houses that we would say, absolutely not. In this neighborhood, that's an 81-year-old house, and it has, true divided light, and it's wood windows that are made from, hard pine, which you don't find anymore as much. And so the quality of wood is different even. So I think we need to be cognizant of that. So again, thank you for the presentation, and Dr. Klee particularly, thank you for those are telling stories about opportunities lost. And we certainly don't want to see that here, particularly in our historic environment. But we're not talking about that as we go out and further into the neighborhood. So thank you.
Thank you for the presentation, Ms. Burke and Dr. Klee. I came to Williamsburg in large part because of Colonial Williamsburg and its attractiveness, so I appreciated his comments on that. I had a couple observations based on his presentation. I think in terms of historic preservation, it is always important for us to remain mindful of being careful stewards. And, I think a lot of the stories of the lost opportunities that he has presented has also been intertwined with certain zoning decisions that city councils and board of supervisors have made, whether it was a single issue about affordability or with increased population pressures. What we saw in those pictures are also reflections of those decisions, along with perhaps architectural review. And I think I wholeheartedly agree with Dr. Klee's assessment that this city and this city council has been careful stewards of looking at the holistic picture of historic preservation, and I don't see us changing that anytime soon. So I don't want to be made out as the boogeyman. I don't think I'm pressing for synthetic new materials, and certainly not, as Vice Mayor Ponce had stated, in the historic area. I do think, though, that our holistic viewpoint and our approach towards historic preservation will carry us and will endure us through certain changes that we're going to see in the Commonwealth. Real quickly, I saw that there was a bill that would, legislation that would impose upzoning requirements into Virginia localities, but given how careful the City Council has made its zoning decisions on, I believe that our commitment to historic preservation will preserve those single-family, low-intense use neighborhoods that we all are very fond of and consider as crucial parts of our community. So I think this council is still committed to the mission of historic preservation in leaps and bounds that other localities have not seen and probably will never see. Now, with that in mind, I think a lot of the examples that I've seen in his presentation point to, I think, what the U.S. Interior Secretary and perhaps even our local Department of Historic Register would consider historic, which is, houses from the 1910s. But as Vice Mayor Ponce has alluded to, there are also houses in these AP1, AP2, and AP3 districts that were built in perhaps maybe not even as soon as 1960s, but 1950s. So we have this discussion, I think, that is really important that needs to take place, is how can we balance our commitment to preservation but also to the practical needs of maintenance. So I had a personal story that probably is well publicized at this point, but I think it's struck to the core of these case-by-case bases. There's some really close calls. And what I ultimately want to avoid is a undermining the credibility and our faith in the historic preservation and maintenance of certain things, because to a certain point, a repair may be impractical, as opposed to seeing the rules that allow a lot more leeway for materials used for new houses or new additions to homes. We've got to address that with the public. And I think, I was told once by a developer in another locality that had said that he was denied a certificate of appropriateness to demolish a historic building. Well, he understood the civil penalty that came along with demolition of it and demolished the structure anyways, and it was lost forever. We don't want to get to that point, and I don't think we will, but we've got to make sure that we also see from the other extreme end of ensuring that we have the public credibility behind exactly why we're doing what we're doing and with the materials that we are introducing and maintaining as an ARB and, imposing our homeowners. So I think there's a lot of room to talk about new materials, as you have highlighted. I think there's a lot of opportunities to talk about different other issues like lighting that you have mentioned. But I think in terms of the cautious approach, the cautious stewardship, I'm confident that's going to remain. But now we have to have this conversation about where can we balance the practical uses of homeowners that desire to maintain the existing uses of their homes without having to get to some sort of market inefficiency or some sort of difficulty locating a contractor that could do a true dividing light window. And maybe perhaps even the way that ARB members interpret certain guidelines. So munions, for example, and true dividing lights for windows, let's just say, because I know this subject, are not included in the guidelines. It does say that it should be a replica of what the existing windows are. Well, there's a lot more leeway in interpretation, and I've not taken a class on statutory interpretation, but I don't read that as a must. So on a case-by-case basis, I think there's a lot of room that ARB members have, but it is a close call, and I think we should not lose sight of historic preservation. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I will agree with Benny on a few things, one including that we shouldn't lose sight of historic preservation. And as I was listening to the guidelines and just reviewing the areas, I thought of the street that I live on, Griffin. And it is definitely an eclectic street. And I think that, it just bears to mind some of the things that need and have been taken into place. For one thing, we have Pollard Park that is on the National Historic List of registered houses. And then across the street and up the street a little bit, we have a little bungalow that who knows when it was built, and it's been used by rental students for probably it's been used as a rental for students for probably the last 55, 60 years. And so, as we look at some of these houses that have been used for rentals for a really long time, and the homeowner or the landlord's owner's not taking care of them, then the maintenance for someone who would want to come in and buy it as a home becomes much higher and harder. And I own a rental house on Griffin and had sort of a similar case a couple years ago when I needed to replace a couple pieces of siding on the house. And I couldn't find it anywhere here in Williamsburg. So I went to Richmond to buy 2 pieces of wood. And because that was the only place that was available. So I think it is good that we take into account different materials that are becoming available and sort of think about, so what happens when the existing materials are no longer available in Richmond at a lumber yard? Is someone going to need to go to Washington, or are they just not going to be available at all? So I'm pleased that you're going to be looking at those materials. I do think that the eclectic nature of the neighborhoods is really what makes Williamsburg very special. And I've made it known, I think we need to tell the stories of those neighborhoods even a little bit more, particularly Pollard Park and Chandler Court, because they do have a value in the history and the story. And the house that I own on Griffin, the rental house, was built in 1932. So if my math is correct, it's 88 years old. And as I say, there's only certain things that finding the materials. I would agree that I would like to see windows added to the list of topics that you're going to review. So that's it for now. Thanks.
Thank you. My suggestion is that we have a meeting where we talk about general philosophy, other than this one. And maybe that's occurs after the AP 1 through AP 3 meetings where there's been some input, and then we can sort of step back and talk about philosophy. Also, I think it's very important for the specific AP meetings that everybody that lives in those sectors are aware of the meetings. And maybe the chiefs can help us through the CERT network in terms of sector leaders, getting that word out so that we get good attendance there. Question on the AP2. So which AP section is the Stryker building in?
I think it's AP 2.
AP2, I think.
1.
So AP2, so I'm looking in what was on the screen there. It says new buildings and additions should be constructed of brick, horizontal wood siding, or cementitious siding. So how does that apply to the Stryker building?
Probably because it's the government.
It's in the AP. It's in the AP2 district. The board is allowed to make allowances on a case-by-case basis for new construction. And the guidelines have been flexible in that they recognize that you can't have everything look like Colonial Williamsburg because that takes away from what Colonial Williamsburg actually is. If a visitor to the city were to come here and see a building that looks old but it's not, it cheapens the older buildings. And so by allowing for newer materials or more modern construction, the guidelines allow for a person to differentiate between older construction and new construction.
So in AP3, which you would think would be less restrictive, it talks about windows in the Arts and Culture District must have muntins on the exterior. And that seems a little bizarre to me, especially where if I want to go contemporary, I would think that would be the area that I want to do it. Why are we requiring muntins there?
I would think, and I was not here when these guidelines were written, but I would think that the purpose of that is the existing construction in that area is older, and the type of windows and the style of architecture that you see in that area have exterior muntins. I'm not sure why it would require them specifically in the architectural or in the Arts and Culture District, but I would think that it's a nod to the type of construction you see in that area.
Okay, so this was under the new construction section. So taking your philosophy on AP2, where we want to designate this is new construction, I don't see why we're requiring muntins if we want to be allowed for a contemporary.
Well, I think you have to take into consideration that windows come in, if you have buttons in your windows, they have to be on the exterior. There are buildings that are built with no buttons in the window that are single pane, single up and single down. And we don't require those to have buttons. I think the important thing when we looked at the Arts and Cultural District was when we looked at those guidelines, there are some very older bungalows that are on Richmond Road that have the bungalow style windows in them. And we didn't want to lose the presence of those windows or those windows by saying you could take all the windows out and put in any window you wanted. So there was a balance there on how we treat the Arts and Culture District. And I think the AP3, a little history on AP3. AP3 was done in the guidelines because in those older neighborhoods, the vinyl windows, the aluminum windows, the vinyl siding, the aluminum siding had really taken over a majority of these neighborhoods long before the guidelines were taken over. So before the AP3 district was done, we were considering those the same as AP2, which when we looked at the guidelines last time, we said that's too high a standard for these neighborhoods where a lot of the historic fabric has already been removed. And so that's a little of the history on how the AP3 district came to be, because those 3 or 4 little teeny tiny neighborhoods a lot of the historic fabric was already removed. And we were most concerned with the bungalows and in the Arts and Cultural District and the removal of windows and the siding for those. So we wanted to be a little careful. We allowed the more colors, we allowed signage, we allowed brighter colors and those kinds of things in there, but we still wanted to look at those buildings carefully before the windows were allowed to be removed.
So I think that maybe points out the terminology and the words that we're using. So when we redo them, I think we need to be more specific in terms of wording. We say guidelines, whereas it seems to me everything I'm hearing is requirements. We've got wording that says should, where I'm hearing really shall is what you mean. And I think that would be applicable in this, where we just read about the muttons, saying that they must have muttons on the exterior. So I mean, I understand your interpretation, but I don't read it that way. So I think we can be more specific in terms of how we write that. That's all I had.
I don't have a story about a farmer and a pig, but I do recall a colleague talking about historic preservation and the importance of why communities or organizations, governments would want to undertake historic preservation. And his rationale was that every building tells a story, and each building tells a different story, and every piece of that building is a part of the story. So when you start taking out various parts, you start removing words from the story. Then eventually you're removing sentences, and eventually you're taking out paragraphs and chapters. And at some point, the story no longer has the same meaning that it had, and you've really undermined the historic integrity of a structure. What we all need to determine is how valuable is that story to us? How valuable is it to our community? And how worthy is it of preservation? I have a couple questions. What is cellular PVC? I assume that's not a phone made out of plastic.
No, it's not hollow, essentially. It's a solid material.
So it doesn't have wood fiber in it?
No, it's
Okay.
plastic. It is PVC, but it's not a hollow. The best way to describe, the best visual I can give you is if you, like a cellular PVC fence or rail, if it's hollow, you feel it. It feels flimsy in your
It'll
hand.
bend easily.
Exactly. A solid cellular PVC is
More structural
Yes.
integrity. So why, in none of the districts I don't at least recall you mentioning any requirements on true divided light? Why is that?
So new construction does not require true divided light wood windows. It's not a requirement in new construction. The way the guidelines are written for windows is if it's an existing window, it has to be, and it meets the requirements for replacement, that has to be replaced in the same form. And that form, more often than not, is true divided light. New construction does not require true divided light.
One thing I would like to see the Architectural Review Board consider and staff as the guidelines are evaluated is even more flexibility in the Arts District, Arts and Culture District. I know you talked about it a little bit in towards the end of your slides, but allowing for a little more creativity, I think would be important if that district is ever going to develop any kind of character on its own, which it seems to be lacking. So I don't pretend to know how that would be accomplished or what it would look like, but I just ask the members of the board to consider that. So these guidelines have been in place now for almost 30 years. Is that right?
91.
I have to imagine that implementing them was the toughest part of this entire process, because somebody had to come up with them. Then they had to convince people that they were worth adopting. And then somebody had to go back and tell all the pre-existing property owners, hey, guess what? We've just put new restrictions on what you can do with property that you own, and here's why it's good for you. And somehow they were able to do that. And somehow it's also helped benefit this community in that intervening period of time. So I think it's important for each of us to understand that each change or each relaxation of those guidelines, as worthwhile as it may seem at the time, is losing something we will probably never be able to regain. But it all has to be balanced with how, not only do we maintain some aesthetic character or historic sense of our community, but what is going to best stimulate highest quality maintenance of these properties and help us retain a reasonable degree of owner occupancy percentage. Because if the guidelines become too restrictive, or if they, as time evolves and we don't evolve with it, it's possible that we drive circumstances in the other direction in the example that Ms. Ramsey was talking about. Again, I don't have the answers, but those are things we need to consider with that appreciation that once those changes are made, we've lost a little bit of ourselves in the process. Anybody? Yeah, I just want to make sure.
So, Ms. Burke, I had a quick question. Hasn't the U.S. Secretary of the Interior provided the most recent updated historic preservation guidelines? And I'm not just talking about windows, I'm talking about for its entire document. And how often does the ARB update new materials into the current design review guidelines for consideration?
Typically, the ARB incorporates new materials during this update process. In some cases, the guidelines are written that they can allow new materials on a case-by-case basis, so we'll see those incrementally. The best example of that recently is the composite windows that were installed in a home on South Henry Street. The board saw those in person, they liked them, and we've seen them, I think, 2 more times since that installation. So we found a new material that the board liked, and it's kind of been incorporated just by chance. But it would be good to be able to formally incorporate something like that into the guidelines. To amend the guidelines for something so small, it's a rather large process. It has to be heard by the ARB, then it has to be heard by the Planning Commission, then it has to be heard by City Council. So those end up in my notes in my notebook, and then they kind of all get grouped together for a large update process.
Now we have this meeting because you've got a stack.
Exactly.
You know, the only reason why I raised that is because I know we shouldn't compare ourselves to other historic preservation boards because we're probably the best, right? But seeing some of the other local examples, perhaps in the old Georgetown area, it seems that their staff had followed closely to what the U.S. Secretary of the Interior, which we do as well, but with their updates. For example, speaking specifically to windows, they noted in their guidelines about metal spacers to simulate the true divided light stuff. So I was curious to see how often our staff would incorporate that kind of analysis or that update into it. But it seems like this is more on the interpretive case-by-case basis rather than having to go through the whole process of the public hearing, which is fair.
I'd like to give you an example of the Architecture Review Board looking at a product that ended up not turning so well. We had several, probably over 10 years ago now, we had a company come through called Spray On Siding. And as a test case, we had a couple houses use that product. And guess what happened? Spray On Siding rotted the house from outside in, basically. So sometimes we look at a product and we put it on a couple of examples of places we do, and we test it before we outright say, yeah, that's the best thing that's happened in Williamsburg, let's put it everywhere. Another example of that is shingles, synthetic slate shingles. The first batch that came out with that, we put them on a couple of residences, and come to find out the color didn't go all the way through the shingle. And in that instance, when a tree branch or something hit it, it scarred the shingle and you saw the white underneath it. So we learned from examples of new materials, and sometimes it may seem it's a slow process, but we're careful in what we do and how we do it because we want to have the best product and the best look and the best thing through the city. So those are a couple of things that I can think of right off the top of my head on that are good examples of why we test things.
And I greatly appreciate your commitment to doing that. And I think, I think there's no problem with continuing to take on that approach. I would think that also the U.S. Secretary of Interior, when they make a recommendation on certain materials, already been proven to be, of some historic value or along the preservation guidelines.
Mr. Spence, come to you. If you and your colleagues would like to share observations, thoughts, questions, love to hear it.
Well, I've enjoyed listening to each of your comments.
Now tell the truth.
And, I certainly understand that you have a lot of public comments come your way, and people have different concerns, and we do too. We're sort of where the rubber meets the road, at least two times a month. And so when applications are made to us, we really do use these guidelines as our guidepost. And I know several times it's been thought that, they're just guidelines, but you can really utilize, your good judgment. And we do when we feel like we have the latitude to make good judgment, but we can't generally stray too far from the guidelines. So whatever the guidelines end up being, we do use those as our guideposts, meeting and after meeting after meeting. So I think we look forward to the discussions and hearing where concerns are and where perhaps alternate materials could be used. We're here, we serve the city. You've appointed us. We all have different backgrounds. We all have different interests, and we all live in various neighborhoods in the city, so we understand the situation. And I look forward to a good outcome. But again, I can't stress too much how much we depend on the guidelines, whatever they are. And as it's been mentioned, they've changed 6 times since their first writing. And I would dare say that the guidelines have not gotten smaller, they always get larger. And I suspect it's going to happen again. And I'm interested to see the discussions that we do have. And I think Mr. Maslin's comment about having another discussion together, maybe after we've gone through at least the first 3 AP districts, is probably a valuable tool, because I think philosophy behind the design review guidelines is the driving force. And I think that's something we all have to be on the same sheet of music. We can differ and on different situations and different materials and different designs, but I think the overall philosophy, we all have to coalesce around the shared philosophy. And I think we're not really going to get to that today. And I think we really do need a separate session where we can do that together. And those are my comments. My colleagues are here, and I'd love to hear what any of them have to say.
I'm looking forward to the process. I've been through it a couple of times already, and I think the last review in 2013 was the guidelines became much more understandable since they're on our website and available to the public. So you could look at what area you're in, and you could tell what we went through each area of the guidelines so that you can understand. And I think that was a big improvement, and I'm looking forward to looking at new materials and looking at the neighborhoods specifically. And I think it'll be fun, I think.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to amplify Dr. Klee's comment about the fact that something is 50, 60, 70, 90 years old does not mean that it's not historically significant. I really think that it is significant, and we have to pay very close attention to that. A case in point that's not been raised before is if you drive to downtown Gloucester, which is a treasure, it's a jewel. The common in Gloucester, surrounded by areas that have not been preserved. And we don't want that to happen in Williamsburg. So we really need to closely look at maintaining everything that surrounds the historical district. Secondly, the guidelines will always need room for interpretation and judgment by the ARB. No matter what the outcome of this rewrite is going to be, it will not be 100% definitive because things change. And so don't look for absolute crispness in what's allowed and is not. There are always going to be guidelines. And once again, when we make a decision about something, as the mayor pointed out, once something is gone, it's gone forever. And we're not going to be able to unring the bell. So we need to be really careful here in how we interpret these things.
I'm new to this board, but I do think that one of the things that we should keep in mind as we go through this process is that buildings do not exist for their own purposes, and that buildings are actually for people, and we have to keep, particularly in the neighborhoods where there are private residences, that there are people to consider that have to maintain, as the mayor said and Ms. Ramsey said, that have to maintain these residences. And if our objective as an organization is to have a high percentage of owner occupancy, we have to keep in mind the cost to those people and the stress to those people of adhering to guidelines that may or may not make their house more livable, more easy to maintain, and we move into the potential of simply letting them continue to decay.
Just following up on that, along with what everyone else has said, that in providing for the materials that allow for the proper maintenance and the extended maintenance of these properties, you also improve the marketability of these properties, as opposed to fighting with markets of new construction or newer construction. These neighborhoods become more marketable as they are easier to maintain with some of those new materials.
And just to follow up on a point that's already been made a couple times, I think a really important discussion for us is how do we transition properties that have long been rental properties and we want them to become owner occupied? What does that process look like, and making sure that the houses that the properties that we're looking over, making sure that we attend to them properly. As Mr. Spence talked about, we really use the guidelines very carefully and are very cautious not to set new precedent and going too far outside the guidelines. So we keep that in mind, close to our hearts as we're making our decisions.
Well, thank you all very much. Do you any closing words, sir? Anybody else?
Well, I think as we embark on this, I hope that we're not leaving you all with the sense that some of us have said that, let's lessen the guidelines arbitrarily. I think, I'm confident that you all will, put forward a good effort to, look at the districts again, look at the homes again, and see, and then look at products and materials to see if there isn't an opportunity to introduce new products that might make the homes more marketable, more livable. Last thing we want to do is eat the leg off the last remaining leg off the pig.
Mr. Trivett, hearing Mr. Maslin's suggestion, Mr. Spence's endorsement of that suggestion, do you think we could work on scheduling something when the time is right?
It seems like the answer to that is yes.
Great. I'd love to hear that.
I'm not a scholar of politics, but it seems like the answer is yes.
Very eloquently said. And I really want to thank every one of you, each and every one of you, staff and the ARB. I don't know who said it about maybe it was you, Scott, about where the rubber meets the road. You all are making these decisions twice a month, every month, and they're not always easy. And we know you're doing it in the best interest of this community, and you don't always get unanimous endorsement, but we really do appreciate everything that you do, because you're the ones that are out there preserving our built environment for all of us. And we appreciate all the effort you put into it, and I don't think most residents understand how much time goes into the work that you do and how much you do outside of the meeting, going to see the properties and evaluate the circumstances. So on behalf of my colleagues, just want to say thank you. This takes us to City Council communications. Oh, you have something?
One, I just wanted to congratulate the police chief on being appointed to the Avalon Board of Directors, and we'll be well served to have your service on there.
Anybody else from council want to highlight anything from liaison assignment? Schedule of meetings, Mr. Trivett? I guess we have a fun one tomorrow.
That's right. We have the budget retreat starting at 11. And then there is the EDA meeting on the 12th and the city council meeting again on 13th.
Questions, Mr. Trivett? No? Open forum. It's time for anybody who would like to address council to please come forward. We ask that you state your name and address, and if you could keep your remarks to 5 minutes or less, we would all greatly appreciate that. Welcome, Dr. Cranbuell.
Thank you. Welcome. Good to see all of you, and I certainly appreciate the comments from the board. My name is David Cranbuell. I live at 201 Harrison Avenue. So just listening to this, I pick up a few things that I think need to be, oh, by the way, I won't be here Tuesday, so that's partly why I'm speaking now, and hopefully what I say will be restored or remembered on Tuesday. But I think the point is, yes, we're for preservation, but preservation means the house is still attractive to live in 100 years after you're gone and I'm gone. So we have to be making it livable to preserve it. Otherwise, nothing's going to happen. A second thing we have to realize, as just pointed out by members of the board here, is that these things cost money, and the more the restrictions are in whatever district you're in, the more money it costs, and who's supposed to pay for that? Each resident is in charge of, or is the city partially responsible? All of us collectively. That's an important ingredient. Now, another point that was made several times, which I feel quite strongly about, is this issue of windows. 2 city council people brought it up, thank you, and a third brought it up tangentially, and I think he's brought it up in other ways if I read the Gazette properly. Windows are extremely important, as big as siding or bigger. Second thing that's big is existing houses as opposed to new construction. There's hardly any space for new construction unless you allow a tear down, and we already know what kind of problems that raises. So windows and the issues with existing construction is the heart of this thing. Now let's look at a simple point here. We all believe here, I'm sure, in climate change, global warming. Requiring, as somebody pointed out on the city council, when you go from the inside to the outside, every single case it said, which is, in my opinion, flat out wrong, is that if you have an existing wood window, you have to retain it and fix it up. That makes no sense to me. First of all, that window totally violates any interest you have in protecting our environment from. That window leaks heat because it's a single pane window. That window shrinks in the winter, which leads more heat to go out the door. And it swells up in the summer, which means when I lived in here with a window air conditioner, I had to take the drawers of my dresser and leave them half open, or I never could get to my socks or my t-shirts or whatever in July and August because the window swells up. So when somebody tries to open it, and if the safety inspection hasn't come in July or August, that window that has to be accessible to a student in every single bedroom won't open. So wooden windows, single pane, make a house not attractive for future residents any more than an old kitchen or an old bathroom or having a coal furnace or something like that as opposed to modern heating systems. So that to me is extremely important. To re-look at that whole thing. We need to make it attractive for people to want to act. In my neighborhood where the rental houses are, I have seen 0 improvements in the 20 years to 30 years I've lived there, and I see support from another person who lives in that neighborhood. So if we don't make this attractive and financially feasible and of interest to somebody who might want to buy that house, if it's a rental or just a regular house, then what's going to happen is nothing. nothing will happen, nobody will act, and nothing will get done. And I guarantee you, that's the action with windows. And it's going to be the action with a lot of these other things with the new materials. But I'm very confident, based on the comments of the members of the board and members of the city council, that we'll work this out. And I'm just trying to point out that that needs to be a bullet item. So Carolyn, I'm sure you're taking notes.
Thank you, Dr. Cranville. Would anybody else like to address council? Seeing no one, close the open forum. We do not have any items for closed session today.
Yes, sir. So I'll move to adjourn.
Second.
Ms. Felico?
Mr. Maslin?
Aye.
Ms. Ramsey?
Aye.
Mayor Fryling?
Aye.
Vice Mayor Pons?
Aye.
Mr. Zhang?
Aye.
Mr. Spence, do you need to do a formal adjournment or no? Council will take a brief break and we will reconvene.
Carolyn said yes.
I'm sorry. You've been overruled.
Yes, I've been overruled.
Okay.
So, someone make a motion?
Aye.
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 Okay, now council will take a brief recess and we will reconvene as the Williamsburg Redevelopment Housing Authority shortly.